I want to start my talk first with an odd quote, which I will actually explain a little bit later, but it kind of is an interesting setup. It's a quote from a letter that Markus Brann, editor of the Monatsschrift, wrote to Ismar Elbogen. And he says in this quote, it's regarding a piece I will explain later, that für eine Apotheose Geigers ist unwidersprochen in Frankls Zeitschrift kein Platz. There's no place for unchallenged apotheosis of Geiger in Frankls journal. And when you think of the fact that Geiger was involved in founding the Hochschule, and Frankl was not only involved founding the Breslau seminar, but was the first and founding editor of the Monatsschrift, you might see here a setup which might lead to a not so nice story about people who don't talk to each other and who don't like each other on personal grounds, and thus also influence their research. I like to paint a different picture, but this is part of the picture. So I will talk about the entanglements of both places through the Monatsschrift, but I will also talk a little bit later about lines not to cross. Next slide, please. But at the beginning, let's remember a little bit the history of the Monatsschrift. In October 1815, Zacharias Frankl published the first issue of the Monatsschrift für Geschichte und Wissenschaft des Judentums, closely linked to the Breslau Jewish Theological Seminar that would open only 3 years later. The Monatsschrift would become the leading journal of Jewish scholarship, lasting more than 80 years, publishing almost 5,000 contributions by more than 750 authors. It was an academic journal in a classical sense, assembling mostly research-driven articles, book reviews, and miscellaneous notes. Although Frankl would discuss contemporary developments within German Judaism in an annual editorial, using the Monatsschrift as his forum for his own agenda. Thereby, the Monatsschrift continued an endeavor which Frankl already pursued in the 1840s with his first journal, Zeitschrift für die Interessen des religiösen Judentums. Für die religiösen Interessen des Judentums. Okay, I have to correct myself, which was in general much more political. Frankl was followed in 1869 by Heinrich Graetz, who discontinued this annual editorial, but as well published pieces critical of the reform movement, thus emphasizing the roots of the Monatsschrift in the Breslau seminar and in conservative Judaism. In 1882, he got an assistant, Pinkas F. Frankl, who would help with editing the journal. And he is actually the first formal link to the Hochschule, as he started to teach there in 1883. Frankl unfortunately died rather unexpectedly in 1887, which led to Graetz's decision to discontinue the Monatsschrift due to the heavy workload. But he hoped for a continuation, which came 5 years later, with Markus Brann and David Kaufmann, former graduates of Breslau. Brann and Kaufmann were close friends from their Breslau years, and prior to reopening the Monatsschrift and until the death of Graetz, they were in close contact also with him. Graetz was not so fond of the idea that Markus Brann would be involved, but he was very much appreciative of David Kaufmann, who would become one of the leading scholars of Wissenschaft des Judentums. It's quite ironic that Brann actually would succeed Graetz at the Breslau seminar and would at the end become the longest serving editor of the Monatsschrift. Since Kaufmann's untimely death in 1899, Brann edited the journal until his own death in 1920. Brann and Kaufmann further strengthened the academic focus of the Monatsschrift, while at the same time opening it up for new authors and new topics. And I will go into this also in a minute. In 1920, Isaac Heinemann followed as editor. He had studied in Berlin at the university, as well as at the Orthodox seminary, also not so far away from here. And he came to Breslau in 1919. Leo Baeck, the editor of the final issue of the Monatsschrift, had a connection to Breslau and Berlin as well, as we already heard. He had studied in Breslau and had become a frequent author of the Monatsschrift. But what is about the Hochschule? The next slide. So when the Hochschule was founded in 1872, and the prior developments in connection with the Leipzig Synod. These were events rarely recognized by the Monatsschrift. Interesting enough, the political event, the Synod, was mentioned, but not the foundation of the Hochschule. And also the rare occasions, actually Graz referred to the Synod. He was criticizing its claim to speak in political questions for the German Jewry in its entirety. Thus, the beginning was silence. And now the next slide. But actually, there are entanglements. And I use this picture not because it is historically accurate, but because it's one of the rare still, we try. It's rather one of the rare images we have where we see Wissenschaft des Judentums scholars in a group showing how scholarship is often done. It's not, that's a bird, I'm sorry. It's rather not the image, I'm sorry that I didn't put it in, it just slipped my mind. We all probably know this image of Moritz Steinschneider at his desk as the sole work of a scholar who's working on its own and so on. Scholarship, and I would argue I went through numerous of archives of scholars. It's a social endeavor. People are in contact. They write letters to each other. They meet in these places. So entanglements between institutions are visible and are driven by the people who run the institution, who run the journals. And so I wanted to use this image because it's really one of the rarest. And I also would like to see in the future one time a visual history of Jewish scholarship, because it's also interesting how those images shape our impression of these people, including the image of Steinschneider. So what I now want to go in how these entanglements actually looked like, and it's more episodic what I do now, so it's not a complete picture, but I guess it can tell us a little bit. So as mentioned, next slide, Brann and Kaufmann restarted the Monatsschrift, and they did that with a very different approach, or not very different, but at least they reshifted the focus. So the new series in 1892 was a key factor in further opening the Monatsschrift for new circles of authors, as already mentioned, including those coming from the Hochschule, and pursuing a more collaborative approach towards doing Wissenschaft des Judentums and providing a public forum in form of the Monatsschrift. Like Grätz and Franke, Brann and Kaufmann were closely integrated into a scholarly network that spanned over all institutions of Wissenschaft des Judentums and became a resource, which in itself became a resource for opening up the Monatsschrift. But one significant difference between Brann and Kaufmann and their predecessors was most evident: their own personal involvement. Franke and Grätz had still filled the pages of the Monatsschrift extensively with research articles and, as shown, in opinion pieces. Brann and Kaufmann were more reluctant in this regard and began to re-establish themselves as a different kind of editors, with a stronger focus on managing the journal. They remained, although, gatekeepers, deciding who could be published and which topics to cover. Nevertheless, political debates faded from the pages of the Monatsschrift, and an association with institutions like the Hochschule or the Orthodox Rabbinical Seminary were per se no ground for dismissal, although other grounds could be there. When it came to those political and ideological differences, Brann and Kaufmann themselves would rather use other venues of German Jewish press than the Monatsschrift. In the effort to open the Monatsschrift, both benefited greatly from the institutional developments within Jewish scholarship, thus founding the Hochschule, rabbinical seminaries, but also associations and networks. And most important here, because it has a close link to the Monatsschrift, is die Gesellschaft zur Förderung der Wissenschaft des Judentums. Next slide, please. It was founded in 1903 and played here a key role, as its purpose was to promote Jewish scholarship by publishing journals and books, by supporting Jewish scholars who thrive to enhance Wissenschaft des Judentums, by creating and subsidizing shares of Jewish institutions devoted to higher education and research. And one particular element of this program was the Monatsschrift, who now came under the supervision or guidance of the Gesellschaft, who took over actually the financial responsibilities. and while the editorial responsibilities remained with Brann in Breslau. Due to this setup, the Monatsschrift was sent automatically to all members of the Gesellschaft and informed through its pages about activities of the society based on reports and meeting notes and so on. Through its work, the society improved and secured the framework and communication structures of Wissenschaft des Judentums and provided a forum for Jewish scholars beyond their affiliation with either institutions of higher education or any religious party within or those fractions, which also resembled within the Wissenschaft des Judentums, as the Hochschule was considered liberal, and you have the Orthodox, and then Breslau is conservative, and so on. So the Gesellschaft was somewhat a common place. The only people who did not join this framework were more orthodox standing scholars who would actually found a kind of competing Gesellschaft für jüdische Literatur. I missed the entire title. We have also a journal for that. That's in contact memory if anybody wants to check. But that was a much smaller endeavor. And judging from all the reports you find in the Monatsschrift, all these meetings and committees they held, we would, if we would have pictures of that, it would also show again the more social element also of doing science and doing scholarship. And the Gesellschaft, as said, created those opportunities for regular exchange through meetings, committee sessions, collaborative projects, publications, but also public events. And many lectures held in this framework were republished in the Monatsschrift, as well as lectures held at the Hochschule since the early 20th century. And just to give you some impression of numbers, although I will not mention numbers or not anymore, just some little statistics. I hope one could read the names. From here, I cannot read them, but you see contributions by staff members of the Hochschule, and it would be only one element of showing those entanglements via authors, because actually we would also need to identify all the authors who have any other connection to the Hochschule who studied there. That would be a little bit more work. But you see that there are a few, like also Pinkas Frankel at the beginning, who I mentioned at the beginning, who was obviously active because he was a co-editor, but you have some authors who are rather present, but you have also those who never obviously published there. It's Geiger, for example, it's Chaim Steinthal, but also Ludwig Philippson. And next slide. And I just selected a few major contributions, I would argue, that's a little bit my personal opinion, which appeared in the Monatsschrift authored by members of the staff of the Hochschule who are key on my mind to understand, especially early 20th century discourse within the Wissenschaft des Judentums. So you have Hermann Cohen's lecture. He actually gave that at the opening of the Gesellschaft zur Förderung der Wissenschaft des Judentums about like introducing chairs for Jewish philosophy and ethics at rabbinical seminaries and also at the Hochschule. You have, again, Ismar Elbogen. This is one of the articles actually Daniel Schwarz referred to. He has a vast number of articles where he discussed the history of the Wissenschaft des Judentums in the early 20th century. Quite interesting positioning where he sees himself, but also the development and the history. And one of these key texts appeared in 1918 at the Centennial of Wissenschaft des Judentums. And then the next two belong together. This is Leo Baeck's Besitz des überlieferte Judentum Dogmen and Julius Guttmanns Normierung des Glaubensinhalts des Judentums. They belong to a quite interesting debate on dogma in Judaism, which actually was caused by a critical piece on the second edition of Baeck's Wesen des Judentums, which, as most people here know, is a rework of the 1905 edition, which answers to Harnack, and there's a preceding article in the Monatsschrift where he answers Harnack, which is less so much in the book, but you see also there through publications somewhat also a network of texts, which is quite interesting. And there are two other contributions to the debate, actually. And then I wanted also to bring into this picture Max Wiener's quite important contributions on the concept and idea of Jewish philology, which is part of also very particular debates which emerged in 1933 and onwards. So just to give you an impression, like what happens there. But now, next slide, let's explain what is about not celebrating Geiger. And where are the lines you cannot cross? So Markus Brann, as an editor, understood himself as a graduate, teacher, and advocate of the Breslau Seminar, in line in a tradition of Geiger and Frankl. So this became evident in a correspondence with Ismar Elbogen in 1917, and the occasion was a jubilee issue of the Monatsschrift related to the 100th birthday of Grätz. And Elbogen was tasked to write an article on the last issue of the history of the Jews, the one that covers 1750 to 1848. In doing so, he went beyond the mere discussion of the work and used Grätz's perspective on the events of the first half of the 19th century as a means to provide a historical and theoretical interpretation of the history of Jewish reform movement. Elbogen himself, which his contribution with skepticism, he was not quite pleased with the result, and he had some doubts on Brann's reluctance to publish this. And so Brann, he was right on Brann. Brann nevertheless appreciated some aspects of Elbogen's detailed criticism of Grätz and provided actually detailed editorial advice. However, some elements he outright rejected. He objected against Elbogen's portrayal of the reform movement as such and the role Grätz and Frankl played within the controversies of the 1830s and 40s. Which he, I quote, described as, in a German quote now, einen Hochverrat an den ererbten Heiligtümern, a treason against the inherited sanctuaries. And so Brann asked Elbogen to amend his article, otherwise he cannot publish it, or if so, he would have to add an editorial note, which he sometimes did, actually. Now I lost my line here. And he went on and says, there is no place, as I already quote, for an apotheosis of Abraham Geiger unchallenged in Frankl's journal. Elbogen showed understanding for Brann's perspective, but did not see himself in a position to alter his interpretation of reform movement. His aim was to, I quote, bring the various directions of the reform movement to a formula founded in Wissenschaft and to emphasize the role Geiger played for the reform movement that was rooted in scholarly, historical, critical thinking. In this sense, he understood Geiger's work as Wissenschaft or science in the service of reform. At the same time, Elbogen argued this formula could also be applied to Grätz. In the end, Elbogen would rather withdraw his contribution than change it according to Brann's advice. The episode illustrates that the Monatsschrift was continually committed to its founders and first editors, Frankl and Grätz, and thus to positive historical Judaism. As much as the journal has opened its pages to scholars from all kinds of background, there were still lines not to cross. It was not the criticism of Grätz, however, that was the decisive factor, but the appreciation of Geiger. In Brann's eyes, an inadmissible homage to Geiger and his work would harm the reputation and memory of Frankl. So now, next slide, the break is a little bit bigger because now I jump a little bit in time towards the last issue of the Monatsschrift, which, coming back to the collaborative perspective, is actually the final collaborative endeavor between Breslau and Berlin, and somewhat is also testament to the legacy of both places within Wissenschaft des Judentums. In April 1939, Leo Baeck wrote a letter to Ismar Elbogen, who had only recently moved to New York, reporting on a number of publication projects which he was now responsible for at a time when many scholars of Wissenschaft des Judentums left Germany or were preoccupied with surviving, actually. These included the 83rd and last volume of the Monatsschrift. In the wake of the November pogroms of 1938, the Breslau Jewish Theological Seminary had been severely damaged and closed down. The last editor of the Monatsschrift, Isaac Heinemann, had emigrated to Palestine. In his letter to Elbogen, Baeck emphasized, in first referencing to another publication project, a Midrash on Dvarim, that those involved were committed to conclude in honor. And then he added, with regard to the Monatsschrift, this is, after all, the reason why we want to give the monthly or the Monatsschrift, a decent final volume. We don't want to be merely finished. I hope that it will come out and make a righteous impression, and perhaps somehow and somewhere a rebirth will come for that. The hope for a rebirth remained unfulfilled, as well as the desire to provide the Monatsschrift with a dignified end. And I might add a footnote, there were plans to move the Monatsschrift and the Hochschule to England, although they failed. The last volume for 1939 actually appeared 2 years later in a yearbook, or in the form of a yearbook. It gathered numerous contributions from leading Jewish scholars, as Baeck had intended. But all names of authors still remaining in Germany appeared with the additional Israel, which alongside with Sarah was forced upon German Jews. Furthermore, an article by Selma Stern on the history of emancipation in Prussia fell victim to censorship. More devastating, actually, the issue on this volume never found its audience. Immediately after going to press in 1941, the edition was confiscated by the Gestapo and destroyed. A few copies survived and made it possible to feel at least the hopes of Baeck 20 years or more than 20 years later. In 1963, the Olms Publishing House issued a reprint of the Monatsschrift, including a facsimile edition of this very last volume that also included Selma Stern's contribution on Prussian Jewish history. Max Grünwald, who had himself contributed to the 1939 issue, was now entrusted to edit this piece and edited then a preface in which he wrote, "With this volume, the rich literary activities of German Jewry, which had tended to increase during Nazi period and with which the oppressed kept themselves spiritually and morally awake, came to an end. The difficult, laborious correspondence that Leo Baeck and his associates conducted with the authors of the articles published here was among the last correspondences of German Jews outside Germany. The Monatsschrift, which appeared on the eve of annihilation of European Jews and in the midst of dissolution of German Jewry, was his last collective expression." Only a few months later, in 1902, we all know the Hochschule ceased to exist. And with it, Wissenschaft des Judentums, as it flourished for more than 120 years. Thank you.